So, if they're wondering, yes, we are here. Anyway, we're gonna be both in Kings and Chronicles, again, because we're gonna be talking about Solomon, building the temple. Again, we've been leading up to this, but now we're gonna take a look at a very unusual story, because we're talking about a sacred building on a sacred site, but the materials come from a heathen. And, but it's almost as if the Lord orchestrated these events, because Solomon's predecessor was his own father, who was King who? David, and who desperately wanted to build the temple, but the Lord wouldn't, so he put all the preparations in place, including political alliances. So there was a time of peace. It would have been hard for Solomon to build during a time of war, if they were out warring with other nations or tribes or something. But it was a time of peace. But not only was it a time of peace, but he had a peace treaty with Hiram, king of Tyre, of Phoenicia. And you might say, well, so what? Well, we're going to talk about the so what, because basically the Phoenicians had what the Israelites needed. The Israelites had what the Phoenicians needed. We're going to talk about that. And so they had a good relationship until the Babylonians came along, and they kind of spoiled everything. So, all right, so if you have your Bibles, if you could turn to 1 Kings chapter 5 and verses 1 through 6.
Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had appointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always been a friend of David. Then Solomon sent word to Hiram, saying, "You know that David my father was unable to build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. Behold, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to David my father, saying, Your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place. He will build a house for my name." Keep going, I'm sorry.
And verse 6.
Now therefore command that they cut for me cedars from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will give you wages for your servants according to all that you say. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut lumber like the Sidonians.
So, Mark, I don't understand. Why didn't you just go down to Home Depot?
There wasn't any such thing.
Oh, that's the problem. Well, even if there was, he would have run them out of materials really, really quickly. So, all right. So, if you take a look at page 39 of your study guide, there is a larger map than the one we have here on the board, and it is the Mediterranean coast off of Israel and Lebanon. And so you have modern-day Israel, you have modern-day Lebanon, and you have Joppa, which was part of Israel, and then you have Tyre, Sidon, and Gebal going up the Phoenician coast there. And so Hiram was the king of Tyre. They were a Phoenician people, and apparently they were quite powerful, quite wealthy. If you turn to page 40 of your study guide, it talks about how Hiram, king of Tyre, reigned from about 978 to 944 BC. And again, remember, BC, the numbers are backwards. AD, they're what we would call forwards. All right. So Patty and Israel, did it bother you that they have BCE and CE instead of BC and AD? It's before Common Era and Common Era. They don't want to acknowledge that our calendar is based around Jesus Christ. And so they call it before Common Era and Common Era. And so if you might even run into that in some books. A lot of people have picked up on that now instead of BC and AD. AD does not mean after death, by the way. Annum Domini, the year of our Lord. Right, right, yeah, it's Latin. All right, so anyway, King Hiram had helped build the palace for David. By the way, just this last year or so, they were doing excavations in the city of David, and they came across some of this rubble, and they found these capitals. Now, it's not a capital like Washington D.C., it means the top of a pillar. And they were stone carved, and they were Phoenician style capitals, which again proves that David's palace was there. Again, the Muslims would like us to believe that Jews have no history. They have no claim to that area. Well, I don't know what you got to see in the city of David. They've done a lot more excavating since I was there. But anyway, that's the lower part, the original part. And that's where David's palace was, and they found evidence of King Hiram even being involved there. So anyway, Solomon responded to Hiram's envoys when Hiram hears that Solomon has actually been anointed, installed, made king in place of David. And so he does not hesitate to ask for help, but also to bear witness. If you go down to the bottom of page 40 in that lower column, it says, but he did not hesitate to bear witness that the temple would be in honor of the glory and character of the Lord, who fought for his covenant people and their king. Now, in a sense, this is being a witness, because Hiram, being a Phoenician, would be a heathen. He apparently did not worship the one true God. Now, later on, he sends a message to Solomon that sounds really good. But your study guide points out that that was probably just political jargon. Our State Department has plans of how we are supposed to communicate with other countries, and every once in a while we screw up. Like, remember George W. Bush after 9/11, when the towers came down and all the other devastation. We knew that these terrorists had been trained in Afghanistan. And George Bush said, we will be on a crusade to get rid of them. Well, the Arab world just erupted, because crusade means, crusaders means the Crusader era. And they interpret that to mean Christians coming and killing Muslims. And that's not what George Bush was talking about. And so again, that's not a word you use when you communicate with Arab countries. So anyway, so Hiram apparently knew that. We're going to talk about that. So anyway, as a result of the divinely aided peace, in other words, Solomon is giving God the credit that they are now at peace, and this is a time when they can build this temple. Solomon wanted Hiram to supply the lumber. These are cedars of Lebanon, and on the bottom of page 40, there's a picture of at least what some of these trees look like. But apparently, this, as we go further in, as to why they were trading, apparently the Phoenician area was a heavily wooded, mountainous sort of area. So it was great for growing trees. Israel is an agricultural area. Now, there are some forests, but most of them had been denuded. When we were there, we went to the Golani forest and we planted trees. Did you ever do that?
No, I read that.
And Israel has planted millions of trees,
Yes.
and they're trying to reforest portions of Israel. But the main part of Israel was a grain-growing area. They grew food. They grew olives, they grew wheat and barley and other things that the Phoenicians would have needed, because they were not an agricultural area. It's kind of like the difference between Eastern Washington and Western Washington. And so anyway, the Sidonians were great woodcutters, great loggers, great at doing things. And so basically Solomon is offering to hire them. We're gonna see, he's gonna send volunteers that are conscripted. But anyway, but basically it's gonna be a Phoenician project to get the wood cut and down to Israel. So let's take a look at the temple materials are delivered in chapter 5, verses 7 through 12.
And it came to pass when Hiram heard the words of Solomon, that he rejoiced greatly, and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, which hath given unto David a wise son over his great people. And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the things which thou sentest to me for, and I will do all thy desire concerning timber of cedar and concerning timber of fir. My servants shall bring them down from Lebanon unto the sea, and I will convey them by sea in floats unto the place that thou shalt appoint me, and will cause them to be discharged there. And thou shalt receive them, and thou shalt accomplish my desire in giving food for my household. So Hiram gave Solomon cedar trees and fir trees according to all his desire. And Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 measures of wheat for food to his household, and 20 measures of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and they two made a league together.
Okay, very good, thank you. So again, you might say, why would God endorse a treaty with heathen people? Well, again, these weren't the average heathen people, and they had what Israel needed. And again, when you take a look at verse 7, Hiram sends this message, Blessed be the Lord this day, who has given David a wise son over his great people. And again, your study guide points out it was probably not political language, what do you call it, between nations. Anyway, he was being a not a good politician, a statesman, whatever. So it sounds very pious, but the idea is that he was going to sell this cedar and this pine to Solomon so they could build the temple. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Wasn't the temple made out of stone? We're going to talk about the stonemasons later on. But there was a lot of wood involved. Rafters, roofs, things like that were made out of this good wood. And of course the cedars of Lebanon were good because they did not rot easily, and they were basically impervious to insects. For years we put cedar roofs on here in this country. All of the wood siding on the church out there that's been there for 80 years, that's cedar. How do we know that? Because we had a really bad windstorm one time and some of it blew off. And when we went to pick it up, it was light as a feather.
Mm-hmm.
And you take a look at it, it's actually cedar. And so that's one of the reasons why this has brought it on the church. But anyway, the idea then was to do what a lot of modern logging is, and that was to float the logs. Trudy took care of a young girl who was very disabled at one time, and her parents had a logging camp in Alaska, and it was a floating logging camp.
Wow.
And they moved from place to place, and where they were in Alaska, the timber comes right down to the water. So I mean, there basically is no area for a big mill or anything like that. And so they had this floating logging camp. I don't know if they still do it, but on the Columbia River, you used to see log floats out there and other areas. Again, they didn't have logging trains, they did not have logging trucks, and so if they could cut the timber close to the water, they could roll it down to the water and then float it down the Mediterranean coast. And so that's what they did. And so, now, in the process then, King Solomon is going to pay for this materials. And if you take a look at page 42 of your study guide, there is a box entitled Annual Payment to Hiram's Workers. And if you take a look at those little symbols, each symbol represents 1,000 either bushels or gallons. Now it's interesting, the version that Mark was reading from, my version says 20,000 cores, K-O-R-S, of wheat, 20 baths, B-A-T-S, of pure oil. So the idea is in order for us to understand it today, you have to convert it.
Yeah.
And so here we talk about bushels or gallons. So there's 125,000 bushels of flour, 125,000 bushels of barley, 115,000 gallons of wine, and 115,000 gallons of olive oil. Now, again, if you might say, well, why were they giving them wine? Again, we're talking about the Middle East in the Old Testament. This was a fermented grape, but apparently it was far less alcoholic than anything we produce today. And even families sometimes would then mix it with water, but it was a way of drinking, getting the fluid down that was preserved that wouldn't give you amoeba or whatever. Anyway, so you're studying
On the bushels too, it says that equals 3,600 tons.
that's a lot.
That's per year, right? That's
Yeah. So then it says on page 42 of your study guide in the right-hand column, if Solomon supported Hiram's court for 36 years, it would help explain why Israel felt economically exhausted at the time of Solomon's death. So we're talking about a lot. But again, they got a lot in return. They got all this labor, they got all these materials that they simply didn't have. They had olive trees, and they probably had some sort of a fir in northern Israel, but nothing like the cedars of Lebanon and this other stuff. So, all right, so this was expensive. But again, Solomon was rich, and the empire was at its greatest at that point. So let's take a look at Solomon recruits builders in verses 13 through 18.
King Solomon drafted men from all Israel, totaling 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon in turns, 10,000 a month, with each spending a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram administered the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 porters and 80,000 stonecutters in the mountains, not counting the chief of Solomon's officers who were over the work, 3,300 who ruled over the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, along with the stonemasons, cut them and prepared timber and stones to build the house.
So, I said this before, that I think there is a spiritual application. Solomon was king. Solomon was a very wise man. He was anointed by God. He was called by God to build the temple. But he couldn't do it all by himself. He needed people, many people who were gifted in ways that he was not gifted. Solomon might have been a great administrator, but he did not know how to cut down trees, and he didn't know how to cut wood. He wasn't a stonemason or anything else. But there were people that God had gifted with these different talents, many of them, who were used in labor for all of this. And again, when I go to the New Testament, Paul calls the church the body of Christ. Elsewhere, Peter says it's like a building. But anyway, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. But we need people to build, people who have gifts and abilities that they can use. And not everybody has the same gift and ability. And so I see a real spiritual application in the church today, that everybody needs to be involved. Now, what is interesting here, apparently they had different rules for citizens and non-citizens. They had aliens in the land. But even these that were conscripted worked 4 months of the year, but 8 months of the year they were off. They could literally work to feed their families. So this was only a quarter of the year when they would actually be working during this period of time. Adoniram was supervised the drafting of the workers, their organization, their work parties, their movements, etc. Adoniram goes all the way back to David. David was the one who appointed him and promoted him. He served all the way through the 40-year period of time. He was assassinated when King Solomon's son Rehoboam became king and started abusing the people, and the people revolted. He was assassinated during that time. So Adoniram was a faithful servant. 40 years of Solomon's reign, and he was in working for David before that. So in addition to the 30,000 workers in the forest of Lebanon, Solomon conscripted 150,000 non-Israelites living in Israel to quarry building stones and transport them to Jerusalem. Of these, 80,000 cut the limestone building blocks from the hills around Jerusalem, and 70,000 transported the massive blocks of stone to the temple site atop Mount Moriah. Now, when you go to Israel today, and you go to the Temple Mount, and you see the retaining wall of the temple, that is not the stones that Solomon put there. Okay? That site was greatly enlarged during the time of Herod the Great. And so the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, the Kotel, whatever you want to call it, that is from Herod's temple, not from Solomon's temple. I don't even know exactly what we still have from Solomon's temple, other than if you go to the eastern wall, to the eastern gate, there is a gate that was built by Suleiman the Magnificent in like the 1100s or something like that. But just on the hill below that, it's the Kidron Valley that goes down into the valley, there's this Muslim cemetery. And a Christian archaeology student who was studying in Israel was taking pictures on a very, very rainy day when the ground gave way beneath him, and he fell into this like vault full of dead bones, dead men's bones. And all he had was the light of his camera, but he could see from the light coming through the hole that he fell through the remains of the original eastern gate. So this would have gone back to King Solomon's time. He was able to literally climb his way out, and he ran, got his professor. The next day when they came back, the Muslims had already covered over that hole. They didn't want anybody, because this was a Muslim cemetery. But anyway, so they can't dig there, but he actually has some pictures that are very vague, but it proves that the actual original gate is where the new gate is built on top of that. So that goes back to King Solomon's time. But anyway, you have these stones that were cut elsewhere and brought to Jerusalem. Why were they cut elsewhere and dressed and then brought to Jerusalem? Why didn't they do it at the site? Noise. This was a sacred place, and again, the Jews believe this is where Abraham went to offer up Isaac. This is the threshing floor of Aruna that David bought, and they were going to build this temple to the Lord. And so they cut the stone elsewhere and brought it there. How they did that, we're not totally sure. We have some idea from ancient Egypt how they moved stones. The Romans period, when Herod enlarged the temple foundation, they believed that some of those stones were cut as cylinders and actually rolled down, and then they beveled them off, whatever, at sight.
But that would have been noisy.
That would have been noisy, but that was during Herod's time.
Oh, that's true.
By the way, I have not seen it because I didn't take the temple tour, the tunnel tour. The tunnel tour was not open when I was there. But the tunnel tour actually goes down to basically the foundation layer of this wall. When you were standing at the Western Wall Plaza, you're about halfway up the wall, apparently. But one of the original foundation stones, I don't remember all of the figures now, but they believe it is the largest cut stone in the entire world. It is huge.
It is. I didn't.
You've actually seen the stone.
Yeah, I stood at one end, and the other guy stood at the other end, and he says, yeah. It was huge.
Right, they believe it's the largest of its
15
type.
feet or
But
something.
anyway, so then the craftsmen of Hiram, king of Tyre, and Solomon, both native Israelites and resident Galileans, were assisted by the men of Gebal, which were residents of Byblos. And if you go back to where we started, on page 39, you'll see the map. Gebal is way at the top of the picture there. So they even conscripted or got residents of other areas to come and help as well. If you take a look at page 44, we're going to talk about what type of stone. And if you go to Israel today, to Jerusalem, the thing that's unique about Jerusalem is that by ordinance, all buildings must be faced with limestone, even modern buildings, to make the city look ancient. And it's called Jerusalem, the City of Gold. Do you know why it's called Jerusalem, the City of Gold?
When the sunlight hits it.
When the sun is setting over Jerusalem and the sun's rays come at an angle, the city literally glows. It's an undescribable situation. Many of the streets are paved also with limestone, which is fine until it rains. And we were coming down the Palm Sunday walk from the top of the Mount of Olives down into the Kidron Valley, and it's a limestone curved street that goes down, and it started to rain. The clouds opened up, started raining, and it was difficult to walk because it got slippery. Anyway, would somebody read the box on page 44?
The stone used to build Solomon's temple was probably limestone. The pinkish white limestone of Israel is soft when first quarried, so it can be cut with a saw and polished to a fine finish. 1 Kings 7:9. After exposure to the elements, however, the limestone hardens to the toughness needed for a durable building material. An ancient quarry under Old Jerusalem is traditionally called Solomon's Quarries and might have been the source of much of the temple stone. If the stone blocks for the temple foundation were comparable to those of Solomon's palace, they ranged in length from 12 to 15 feet and weighed several tons apiece.
Now, I don't know if Patty went down into this quarry. We did not. But apparently it's arduous to get down. But I've seen videos, and there's like these huge caverns underneath Old Jerusalem. When they even quarried a lot of the stone, and the city was above it, and it has remained all these years. And so that's what they're talking about there in this picture. So you would have needed different tools back then, Mark. Far different.
Probably didn't take out their chainsaw with a lit gas motor on it.
Probably not. Probably some form of ancient hammer and chisel and other items. What is interesting though is this stone will break, and apparently if you do a notch in a certain area and then hit it, it'll crack. And the Romans, when they literally blew up Old Jerusalem, apparently they drilled holes into the limestone and stuffed them with flammable material and lit it on fire. And when the fire got so hot, it actually split the stone and they crumbled. And that's how they destroyed a lot of the city, believe it or not, by fire. You wonder how could fire destroy stone, but the way they did it, it cracked the stones.
Was that the same time, or was it later than that the temple was destroyed and all the gold was melting down between the stones, and so the people rushed in and took all the stones away in order to get to the gold, and that's why it was leveled completely? Is that?
That might have been 70 AD. That might have been 70 AD. Because the Babylonians destroyed the city in 586 BC, but most of those people were deported at that time. In 70 AD, most of the Jews were gone, but they were being taken care of. But so 70 AD was the Roman destruction. So. By the way, Tisla B'Av, I'm not pronouncing it right, but it is an anniversary that Israel celebrates every year. And it's the day that the temple was destroyed. Both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the same date on the Jewish calendar, interestingly enough. So. All right, let's take a look at the temple is constructed. And we're going to take a look at a very important number as far as chronology is concerned in the Old Testament. But somebody read verses 6, 1 through 13.
Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. As for the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, and its width 20 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. The porch in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits in length, corresponding to the width of the house, and its depth along the front of the house was 10 cubits. Also for the house he made windows with artistic frames. Against the wall of the house he built stories encompassing the walls of the house around both the nave and the inner sanctuary. Thus he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, and the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For on the outside he made offsets in the wall of the house all around, in order that the beams would not be inserted in the walls of the house. The house, while
13.
it was being built, was built of stone, prepared at the quarry, and there was neither hammer nor axe nor any iron tool heard in the house while it was being built. This doorway for the lowest side chamber was on the right side of the house, and they would go up by winding stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. So he built the house and finished it. He covered the house with beams and planks of cedar. He also built the stories against the whole house, each 5 cubits high, and they were fastened to the house with timbers of cedar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel.
Okay, thank you very much. So, if you take a look at page 44 of your study guide, the right-hand column, halfway down, 1 Kings 6:1 is one of the most important chronological references in the Bible. By synchronizing biblical and Assyrian records, historians can date the 4th year of Solomon's reign as 966 BC. Starting from that known date, the Exodus from Egypt would have been 480 years earlier in 1446 BC. Many biblical scholars, however, treat the number 480 in 1 Kings 6:1 as representative of 12 generations, 12 times 40, and argue for a much later Exodus around 1290 BC on archaeological grounds. I think if you pick up most histories of the Old Testament, they will give you the 1446 date. But again, here's a point. I asked you before last week why all the genealogies are in the Bible. Well, why even include them? Okay, why here do you have lists of grain and wine and olive oil? Why do you have lists of numbers of workers? Why do you have specific dates?
It's all testable. You can look and find out if it's true or not.
Right, it's a historical narrative, okay? Again, I watched a very interesting video on the series, Is Genesis History? And this Dr. Del Tackett goes and interviews a very brilliant man. He's got to be brilliant because his name is Steve.
Mm.
But anyway, he's a Hebraicist. He speaks and reads and writes a number of Semitic languages, including Hebrew. And so in this interview, he asked them, is Genesis poetry? Is it just a fanciful story? Or is it actually history? And this Hebraicist said that he has studied the Old Testament. He's taken a look at the way words are used elsewhere. in the Old Testament. And he says Genesis is written as a historical narrative, not just some mythology, not just some poetry, but actually as history. And this is what you have here, it's history. And again, you can go to Israel today and do what Patty did, get out your trowel and start digging, and you dig up history. Again, I mentioned in the city of David, these capitals that obviously are not from Israel. They're Phoenician in their style. What were they doing in the city of David? Well, they were part of David's palace that was built by Hiram, king of Tyre. So you have all this history, and so yes, we can believe what the Bible has to say. Again, I love J. Warner Wallace and Cold Case Detective, but much of what he talks about is New Testament, especially the Gospels, showing the witness and why we can believe it. All right, so how big was this building? Now, Mark, I know you have some tape measures, but do you have any that have cubit marks on them?
Mm-mm.
No
Not a
cubit
single
marks.
one.
So
Nope.
you don't build in cubits today.
I don't.
Okay, all right. Do you use inches or metric?
I use inches all the time.
Inches, okay. So what happens if you go to Canada? Do they use metric?
I
Or do they
haven't
use
built
inches?
there, so I really don't know. But
Centimeters.
I think most of theirs is centimeters based.
Okay.
And we do have a lot of tape measures with centimeters markings on, but I do use it a lot when I build stairs where you happen to subdivide something. It's really nice to have a centimeter system. It's a lot easier to divide in centimeter fashion than in fractional.
Well, I do know that a lot of tools that come today from foreign countries come in metric
Yeah.
instead of standard, and so, anyway. All right, so how big was this building? And your study guide points out that apparently it was shaped like the tabernacle. And by the way, I need to finish this book. I need to read this book so I can get it back to you, so you get it to Keith.
Oh.
Yeah, but on the tabernacle. But anyway, your study guide says the general shape and floor plan of Solomon's temple apparently followed those of the tabernacle, but the dimensions were doubled. The tabernacle dimensions can be calculated from the combined width of the wall components in Exodus 26:15 to 25. It is assumed that the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle was a cube of 10 cubits on a side, since the one in Solomon's temple was a cube of 20 cubits.
Mhm.
So the ancient cubit was about 18 inches. So Solomon's temple was about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Since the Holy of Holies at the rear of the temple was only 30 feet in height, there may have been a second-story chamber occupying the 15 feet above. The 15-foot deep entrance port stretched across the width of the east end of the temple. It rose 30 feet, 15 feet lower than the roof line. Oh boy, we're almost out of time. By the way, some people believe that the temple for the tribulation could be built even now. And the reason they believe that is that if you take a look at the eastern gate, if you could open it up, the sun would shine at nothing, just open space. There is like a little tiny structure there, but the Dome of the Rock is further south. And apparently, if you take a look at much of the description of the Old Testament, when they opened the gates in the morning, the sun, as it rose in the east, shone through the gate and hit the temple. Well, there's no building there now. So is it possible that a temple could be built alongside the Dome of the Rock? Again, it's only a theory. I'm not saying that's exactly the way it was. But anyway, you have this complete description of everything that went into that. And we won't go into all the details, but it gives you an idea. Just to give you an idea, 90 long, 30 wide. This church building is 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. So it's basically the same width, but just a third longer than our church. So it was not a huge structure, even though the Temple Mount is very big. And it's 45 feet tall, which is about 3 stories.
Yeah.
So, anyway, on page 46, you have kind of a cutaway view of what it may have been like. And then, we won't take time because we're out of time, but if you take a look at page 46, the in brief section that talks about how Solomon paneled, the interior was cedar wood carved with gourds, flowers, palm trees, cherubim, etc., etc. But to my knowledge, there were no animals. Why were there no animals? Because of the prohibition against idolatry. Remember, the Jews did not make images of men or of animals, and apparently it had to do with idolatry. But they did have, agriculture carved.
And they did have in the basin, in the temple era.
Well, that was a bull.
A bull,
Right.
right, bull calves.
Right.
Pulling
And
the
why God allowed that, I'm not sure.
Those were offered as sacrifices also, so maybe that had to do with.
Right. But generally speaking, they did not make graven images. So,
That's true.
yeah. Even today, I did not go to Hadassah Hospital, but apparently they have this beautiful stained glass windows. And Ben Biggers used to have a poster from Hadassah Hospital. And there's one window for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. But they're so stylized that they're not considered idolatrous. Because the danger was people would worship. And one of the problems I have today with at least one particular ancient Christian group is they set up these icons, these images of the saints. They pray to them. And to me, that gets into iconoclasm, idolatry,